See they know the truth and
Please consider supporting us by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons. Your support will be greatly appreciated.
The great prophecy of Mosi turned out to be the prophecy for all Africa. When the first white man appears in the land, the nation will die. Chapter 9. Central Africa. Evidence from a small state. The Kingdom of Cuba. We must not lose sight of what we are doing, the important points of what we have been doing. A partial view of the early history of the blacks from the loss of their Egyptian homeland to the coming of the Europeans has been presented through a summary study of a representative number of states, a continent-wide view of what happened to the whole by looking at typical situations, a people forever migrating, forever on the move, forever in flight from threats to survival, a new location found, sighs of relief, and thanksgiving for a new breathing spell, and new efforts at reunification and state building all over again. But every decade of unsettled life, every decade of wandering over deserts, savannas, and through the forests, every such decade was one of retrogression, of disintegration. Decades of decline, and no newly established state was able to reach the levels of achievements of the past before it was engulfed by either the Islamic East or the Christian West. This is what we have witnessed, no matter what black state was studied or in what region of Africa it was located. One of these wandering groups, unlike the Congolese and Angolans, began to migrate from the Atlantic seaboard before the whites arrived, was free from contacts with them much longer, and therefore founded a new nation that lasted much longer. The core groups was made up of blacks who came to be known as Bushungs. They were moving from place to place toward the interior and finally began the development of the new state during the period when the white storm clouds were slowly rising in all directions, the 200 years between 1475 and 1675, the most critical in the history of the blacks. It was during this period that the great noose of encirclement was completed and fixed, and the blacks of Africa found themselves hemmed in and threatened from all directions, from the north, from the east, from the west, and finally from the south. The white man's march toward world conquest and world domination was in full swing. This most critical period in the history of the race, I say, was such because this closing in on the blacks from all directions was the beginning of the final death blows to what remained of their own civilization. There were dire consequences in terms of their psychological impact on Africans under perpetual danger. A new fatalism emerged that carried the sentence of ultimate doom to the minds of thousands. Some gave up resistance to anything, including a resistance to slavery and a resistance to the barbarism that engulfed those who either went backwards or stood still for mental atrophy. Some tried to save themselves by serving the invaders' cause, even if it meant enslaving and killing their own people. Some believed that because the white man came in big ships with big, earth-shaking guns, cannons, surely they must be the gods of the world. Others saw no sense in trying to maintain the traditional brotherhood and attempts at unity in the face of such overwhelming odds. Rather, the drive must be to secure these guns and ammunitions from the whites, even if it meant ceaseless wars to secure the slaves the whites demanded, secure them by warring on their own kinsmen in neighboring territories. And still, others resolved never to yield, to move and keep on moving rather than submit, to rebuild and keep rebuilding, never giving up, and to fight for unity as the only route to survival, voluntary unity if possible, unity by force if all else failed. These last others were the ones who had the spirit that accounts for the survival of the most bruised and battered of the races of mankind. Such a representative groups were the Bushungs. This their record will show. As the Portuguese slave raids spread, the Bushungs moved inland from the Atlantic, enlisting new followers as they moved or temporarily stopped. They were headed towards the Congo region. Fleeing from the whites was not the only problem for them, as it was not the only problem for the millions who had trampled over Africa before them. So when they had settled on the lower Congo early in the 16th century, their immediate foes were the fierce Jaga warriors, a roaming tribe that seemed to be more interested in raids of destruction than in settling anywhere. They were destroyers, not builders, and they were set on a course to prevent others from settling and building. And while large groups of them did split off from the main body to merge with others and form states, they seemed to be nothing more nor less than bloodthirsty barbarians who engaged in warfare for the sheer thrill of warfare. These eventually opened war against the Bushung state that was forming over a wide area along the Kwango. Under relentless and savage attacks by the Jaga warriors, the Bushungs were forced to retreat along the Kasai and Sanguru rivers, many groups splitting off from the main body and going in different directions. The main body, led by its chief, Woot, entered the plain of Aiul in Kasai and began the formation of a little-known state during the third quarter of the 16th century. It is precisely because it was small and generally unheard of that I selected it for a summary study. There was another reason. It was typical of hundreds of other small black states which, unlike the world-renowned Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, the migrating blacks had built all over Africa, but which seemed to be so insignificant to the conquering Europeans that they were swept away, their people scattered, with no Vancinas to seek out its oral historians to hear how things came to be, what was achieved or failed to be achieved before death came to their society at last. The little kingdom of Cuba, then, having its history recaptured, will be telling their story also, telling it substantially as it was in all fundamental particulars. The Bushung, or Central Organizing Group, was allied in a federation of voluntary kindred groups and other tribes, numbering 18 at the outset. The Siwa and Keti were indigenous, the Siwa, as previously stated, having lived there since the world began. They offered no opposition to the invaders, seemed to welcome them, and became members of the Federal Union under Woot as the elected king. Many of the splintered-off segments from the central groups came in later from different directions to join the Federation. Other members were the Mongo, Pende, Ilibo, Shua, Kel, Kam, Kylewing, Lula, Luba, Ngind, Maluk, Piang, Ngumbi, Baing, Kufa, and Mbingi Nugango. From the very beginning, the core group of Bushung set an example for the nation-building of all of Africa, but few African states ever followed it. First of all, the total population at the formation of the Federal Kingdom can be established between 75,000 and 100,000, of which number the Bushungs were 80%. All of the other tribes combined, therefore, were only 1/5 of the total population. This means that even under the most liberal democratic system, the Bushungs could have dominated and ruled all the other tribes by the sheer weight and power of overwhelming numbers. They did not choose to do so. Here was what might be considered to be a justifiable occasion to depart from the traditional African constitution with its all-embracing democratic system. Quite to the contrary, they followed it to the letter by simply transforming the village council of elders into a council of state in which each tribe, now constituting a constituent province, was represented as an equal by its own chief or representative of its choice. The members of the state council were the electors who chose the king. As it was throughout Africa, the council represented the people, therefore all powers not delegated rested with the council. The significance of this was that the smallest tribe or province, which might only be 2% of the population, was equal in the council to the Bushung group that was 80% of the population, a situation which headcounters might criticize as the very antithesis of democracy. But the numerically dominant Bushungs seem to have been statesmen with a larger view of what democracy means if it is to operate as a unifying force with divergent and formerly independent groups. What they did, in effect, was to make a frontal attack on tribalism, not by feudal denunciations or exhortations, but by actually detribalizing themselves first of all. They not only treated all of the different language groups as equals, but they promoted a national policy of glorifying those cultural variations in any groups which were so outstanding that they should be adopted nationally. Hence, every tribe in isolation that had developed something noteworthy but peculiar to itself, no matter how strange or different from all others, could see its unique culture pattern become a national institution and be filled with both pride and gratitude. If the Pende had a different kind of dance and excelled with it, theirs would become the national dance of Cuba. If the Luba excelled in the architectural arts, they would be the leading planners and builders, and so on in all human endeavors. Each group could win national distinction in one way or another for excellence in one or more fields, including agriculture and cattle breeding. The kingdom was south of Zambia and the northern Katanga, covering the province of Kasai between the Sankuri and Kasai rivers. There were 5 rulers during the short period of 19 years between 1568 and 1587, one being a woman. It is not known whether the council sitting as an electoral college set what seems to indicate 4-year terms. After 1587, longer but still fixed terms for kings or queens also seem to be indicated. It appears that these limited terms of office by kings continued during the supremacy of the council. For a long time, 10 years in office seemed to be the limit. This brings us to a third reason for selecting Cuba as both a sample and example state. Cuba shows how the blacks themselves do undermine and destroy some of their own best institutions and replace black democracy with black autocracy without the slightest external influence or aid whatsoever. What is more, and often overlooked, a king may become a despot by the will of the people. This development, incidentally, is a further justification of my rejection of two equally false doctrines. One is the contention of whites that the great institutions in Africa were Caucasian in origin, and the other is the contention of blacks that great African institutions were destroyed by Caucasians and other outsiders, and by them alone. What it all means is that the African people act and react just as all other peoples do with the same motivations, conditions, or similar circumstances, aims, and objectives. The democratic directions of this state was well established in 1587 when Lesheng Mbao assumed the leadership. The economy was still operating along provincial interest lines and apparently without state direction or participation. The market system was the only integrating economic activity along broad national lines. The Bushungs were still the leading boatmakers, fishermen, and hunters. Because they were the most numerous, this tended to oversupply Cuba markets with fish and game. On the other hand, farm production was not only far below demand, but it was also too limited in variety. This meant a very limited diet of millet, bananas, peanuts, fish, and fowl. The cloth-making industries expanded as the ironsmith and other crafts developed. The building trades were the busiest in the new nation building. These included architects, carpenters, brickmakers, and masons. The political organization. The political structure actually began with the family council or clan council, which is the basic social unit of kinsmen. During the formative period of the state, each clan had its own village. As new immigrants swelled villages into towns and cities, these became divided into clan sections or wards. Each ward sent its elder as a representative to the village, town, or city council, over which presided the village headman, town subchief, or city chief. These chiefs in turn served as representatives of their area on the provincial council over which the paramount chief of the whole tribe presided. The paramount chiefs of the central provinces or states, the original 18 founders, represented their provinces in the central state council over which the elected king of Cuba presided. Conquered states and tribes which came after the federal union were formed were not eligible for representation on the state council, and their chiefs, therefore, could not participate in the election of kings. There were other special benefits and privileges enjoyed by the 18 elector chiefs which other chiefs did not have, or more pointedly, the newcomers had burdens and responsibilities from which the elector chiefs were free. The heaviest of these were the tributary taxes levied on all chiefs except the original 18. This too was to cause trouble later. The government of Cuba. 1. The Council of State. A. The king presiding. B. The linguist, interpreter, and special aid to the king. C. The chief of chiefs. Prime Minister. The title Chief of Chiefs actually is that of the king. Here it means to say to all the chiefs of Cuba, when you see and speak to my chief minister, you see and speak to the king. D. The governors of provinces, paramount chiefs. Each paramount chief or one of his elected generals was in supreme command of all military forces in his province. The king, who was also a governor of his particular tribal province, had only the soldiers of his province under his command. 2. Administrators not members of the state council. A. First chief of the treasury. B. Chief of border defenses. C. Supervisor general of tax collection, goods, and services. D. Chief of the king's household and protector of ancestral tombs and regalia. E. Chief of roads and markets. F. Collector General for tributary states. This office was created in the wake of Mbung Aling's imperialist expansion in 1650. There were 26 kings during the 342 years of Cuban history, or from about 1568 to 1910. As in the cases of Ethiopia, Egypt, Makuria, and other states studied, here also only a few of the outstanding leaders will be mentioned. In thus rigidly limiting the scope, we necessarily passed over many great leaders and important events, just as we shall be doing in the case of Cuba. Here also, we are not interested in chronological details as we are in such things as the development of national policies to unite diverse tribes in a patriotic devotion to one nation, and other policies that would clearly defeat that objective. The founder or founders of a nation constitute the specially honored group throughout Africa, and it is the source of royalty itself. So Cuba was still following the African constitution when it made the central or nucleus group of 18 founders the permanent ruling council to the exclusion of strangers. In Africa, all those who came after the community or nation is established. Yet it is equally clear that as newcomers increased the population, and as the nation expanded by conquering neighboring societies, the reasons for future conflicts were also being expanded. These reasons, noted here in Cuba, were Africa-wide and account for the internal conflicts in the new African states today, even though all discontent has not come to the surface. And, as in the case of Cuba, the trouble stems from the failure to include every segment of the population in a national program of absolute equality and the opportunity to participate so fully in every phase of the national life that a sense of patriotism and belonging to the nation will gradually outweigh that of belonging to a tribe. In short, what we so deprecatingly call tribalism is in fact the necessary cohesive and social mechanism for survival and defense against threats to survival. The tribe is the unit through which the race itself has survived during all of its migrating and scattered circumstances. The enemies that beset it were black as well as white. This the tribes of today know as well as their black brothers outside of the Circle of 18 knew 400 years ago in Cuba. Tribalism will disappear only when the reasons for its existence in the first place disappear. The most noteworthy thing about Cuba in this connection, however, was that despite the great disorganizing factor just mentioned, its original program of uniting many language groups into one nation was so successful that it has not been equaled by any nation in modern Africa. For look what has actually happened. Many tribes, including the Bushun group, merged so completely that they lost their individual tribal identity and language and became one people, speaking one language derived from all the others, the Bakuba, or people of Cuba. This e pluribus unum process that went on continually all over Africa is what makes the work of ethnologists and linguists so baffling and their dogmatic conclusions often misleading, imprecise, and sometimes simply false. Splitting off from a major into a dozen smaller groups, each developing a different language or dialect, then the re-merger of any 12 splintered groups into another major group, forming once again one people and one language out of many, and so on until the next segmentation of many and the later reformation of the many into a society and language group again. It is therefore unlikely, to put it modestly, that any anthropologist or linguist on Africa could take a group of Bakuba today and determine which had ancestors who were Bushung under Queen Ngokedi, or Piang when Leshang Mabal was king, or Ngindi when Umbo Umbash reigned 1680 to 1695, etc. Even members of a group as distinctive as the Pygmies, Siwa, lost their identity through intermarriages with almost all the other groups. Their mingling with other groups was more widespread because, unlike them, they did not occupy a particular province but were scattered in all of them. The descendants of a Siwa Maluk marriage in King Mishe Matun's day, 1620, could not be described as having pygmoid features today, or Maluk either. The reason is simple. There have been too many other crossings and recrossings during the 300 to 400 years that have passed. The religion of Cuba. There was no problem of religious unity in Cuba because there was no problem of religious conflicts in traditional Africa. The blacks, having a common origin and common center of civilization, had the same fundamental religious beliefs throughout the continent, just as all of their other basic institutions were similar. The inevitable variations were insignificant when compared to the universal similarities. The Cubans believed, as all Africans believed, in one almighty God, the creator of the universe. There were numerous ways of expressing the one God concept. He might be identified with the sun and called the sun god, or, as a variation of this, he might be called the sky god. The numerous other gods, far from being in conflict with the great god, were a necessary part of his divine plan, his own deputies and emissaries who had a direct charge of the various departments of life that concerned human needs: the earth, soil, water, illness, health, fertility, planting, harvest, the forests, war, hunting, fishing, rain, etc. There were lesser gods under these. Their rank or importance was determined by their role and the extent of their role. Different tribes might have different tribal gods, or a group of kindred tribes might have the same sub-gods. Each family or clan might or might not have its own clan god, and each member of the family might or might not have his own personal god. In short, the traditional African religion respecting an almighty god and a hierarchy of lesser deities was later taken over by Christianity in the form of patron saints and higher deities who rank next to God himself. It is said that religion in Cuba did not include ancestor worship. This ancestor worship thing is another one of those overdone myths about Africans. The Bakuba did not worship their ancestors, but neither did other Africans, if Western writers are using the term in the sense that one worships God. And of course, they are using worship in this sense, just as they pretend not to understand the role of the numerous African deities, but understand the role of these same deities in Western civilization if we call them patron saints, in the same way as just about every other aspect of African life and history has been misrepresented and distorted. Yet one can understand why a people for whom the idea of immortality is merely a creed would find it hard to understand the all-encompassing religious philosophy of a people who actually believed in life beyond death. From this central belief, numerous other beliefs developed naturally. An important one was that relatives who had passed on maintained a continuing interest in the welfare of those left behind. To justify and preserve this continuing oversight of their ancestors, the living did those things that might merit ancestral approbation. There was ancestor reverence, not ancestor worship. This reverence for elders began in early life with the living and increased with the dead. When food was periodically placed at the graves, nobody expected the ancestral spirits to eat it. Only fools outside of Africa alleged that they did. What they were doing was a demonstration that the communal spirit of sharing was being maintained. Furthermore, if the ancestors approved of this behavior, they were in a position to intercede on their behalf with the deities in times of crisis. The blacks' conception of God was on a scale too grand to be acceptable to Western minds, so they had to reduce it by using a term that is equated with paganism, primitive, backwardness, and barbarism. The word is animism. But the historian and anthropologist are witnesses against themselves, still proving the very opposite of what they intend. In documenting animism as the chief characteristic of the religion of the blacks from the remotest times, they are also documenting the fact that the blacks' belief in the existence as well as the nature of one universal God also goes back to times immemorial. And what is animism? As applied to Africans, it is the belief that the spirit of the Creator or the universal God permeates all of his creations, living and dead. Therefore, any object, animate or inanimate, may be sacred. This concept of God and his creations would be regarded as highly civilized if expressed by a Westerner in some such terms as a reverence for life. Indeed, precisely the same African religious belief becomes the doctrine of immanence in Christian civilization. The Bakuba, people of Cuba, believed that two contending spirits affected man, the spirit of good and the spirit of evil. Evil was thought to be expressed most clearly in witchcraft, which in turn characterized persons engaged in the practice of trying to do harm to others. In Cuba, as throughout Africa, the penalty for witchcraft was either death or banishment. The much misrepresented witch doctor, far from engaging in the practice himself, had the task of combating the practice by trying to help its victims. Hence the title, witch doctor, which came to be applied to all African doctors indiscriminately because of the widespread belief that almost all human ills resulted from the work of evil spirits through evil operators, witches. A long chapter could be devoted to the training of the native doctors and the practice of medicine. This is not our purpose at this point, but it should be noted in passing that writers have generally focused their attention on the entirely superficial externals that disguise the African doctor's real practice of the healing arts. They spent years in the forests studying medicinal properties of various plants and herbs. They went through the same long periods of apprenticeship that all members of the other skilled crafts had to go through under a master. The people were not fools. The prescribed medicine had to be beneficial. If not, the doctor was held to account far more rigidly than doctors are in our times. The African doctor's entire future in his community depended on his successful ministrations, and these must overshadow inevitable failures now and then. And while the psychological ritual of hideous masks to frighten off evil spirits, the wild dance and mysterious speech were all intended to impress the people with the mysteries of healing, carried over to modern medicine and Latin prescriptions, after all of this, the native physician still had to produce satisfactory results or be disgraced. Religion was involved in the practice of medicine, as religion was involved in every aspect of African life. Disease was believed to be the result of some misdeed on the part of the individual himself or the working of an evil spirit. If widespread, the community as a whole may have sinned, either by commission or omission of something that offended either the deities or the ever-watchful ancestors. Songs, dances, and sacrifices were communal activities designed to re-establish the proper relationship between the people and the unseen powers. History and philosophy. Each Cuban tribe was responsible for its own history, and the state was responsible for the history of the nation. It was oral history. The oral historian, again, as in the case of all other crafts, was a trained historian. His basic training was in a mnemotechnical system. His training in memorization began as an apprentice to a reorganized historian, rather than the principal oral historian. There were special occasions for members of the clan to assemble to listen to the story of the clan, and another occasion for the general community to assemble for the overall history of the nation. The absence of written history made the task of the oral historian very exacting. He was generally held so strictly accountable for any errors made in his account that at times the reaction to mistakes made seems to have been unreasonable. For while he was allowed the widest latitude in commentaries of his own, and even in fantastic embellishments designed to shock his listeners or entertain them, he dared not err in reciting the factual data of history. It seems quite clear that not only the elders, who were also well versed in the oral tradition, knew the difference between the mythical and truly historical account, but the people also understood what was intended as amusement and what was the real history. Aside from tall tales, the historian often used proverbs reflecting the philosophy of great leaders and that of the race, praise songs of great men and great events, songs which we would call the blues, which told of past failures and heartaches, and dances of victories won and of thanksgiving. But the assembled elders were always keeping a sharp watch out for any serious errors on the part of the oral historian. He might be removed or even banished. In either case, his career would be ended in disgrace, and his disgrace might wreck his life among his people. On the other hand, if successful, the rewards were great because the oral historian was the community's storehouse of wisdom and one of its most honored personalities. He was the core of the education system. The lineage was the key to the history of the extended family, the tribe, and the nation. Within the lineage were social, rebellious, economic, and political ties that held together the family, tribe, and nation. Shyam the Great. Shyam I was one of the greatest leaders that the black race ever produced, and, considering the conditions and circumstances of his time, I think he was the greatest. He became king of Cuba in 1630, and during the relatively short period of 10 years, he set in motion an economic revolution that transformed the nation and gave it a new forward direction. He was not only far ahead of his own time in perceiving that economic development was the only way to restore the ancient greatness of the blacks, but he is still ahead of the whole black world today in the revival of economic activities on all possible fronts. The economy had remained on the subsistence level. It could hardly be otherwise because the nation was still in its formative stage, still very young. The main activities were still in the fields of agriculture, fishing, weaving, mat-making, basketry, wood carving, carpentry, furniture making, pottery, iron and coppersmiths, sculpture, and painting. There was a remarkable advance in all the arts, especially the pictorial arts. Since it was from the latter that the blacks developed the writing system in earlier times and lost it through migrations, one may wonder whether there was any rediscovery and revival of writing in Cuba. Oral history does not tell us. Or does it? We do not know. What we do know is that the kind of stable society and institutions were developing in this nation from which writing develops as a compelling and almost indispensable need. Shyam's economic revolution stimulated many facets of the national renaissance about which we now know very little. For the revolution of 1630 was a revolution in thinking and a search for new and better ways of doing things. The new king was interested in new styles and a break from the traditional art forms. His drive was for national consolidation and internal development rather than the wars of conquests that so much occupied the time and energies of his predecessors. The slowly developing economy now experienced a sense of urgency and national direction. New crops were introduced: sorghum, corn, millet, not entirely new in the area, tobacco, yams, and beans. The external influence here was black external influence, and now hardly external to Cuba, because some of the tribes now constituting the nation came from areas where these crops were grown. Would yams and tobacco grow in Cuba? Let's find out, Siam seemed to have been saying on all fronts down the line. The skilled crafts were expanded and methods of production improved and speeded up by new techniques. New weaving and embroidery methods were notable. The break with tradition was most clearly seen in the experiments in new art patterns and new styles in wood carving. All this economic activity meant a marked transition from a subsistence to a surplus economy, and this, of course, led to a general prosperity through the expansion of markets and foreign trade. Since Cuba was not within the orbit of the caravan routes of international commerce, her foreign trade was with other African areas. Cuban trade missions were sent near and far to promote trade through the establishment of markets and important trading centers in nearby and distant states. This was the most important aspect of Siam's economic revolution. In the decline of the civilization of the blacks as they splintered off and scattered here and there over Africa and over the world, they lost this pioneering spirit of business enterprise, the most urgent need in recapturing their lost status in the modern world of aggressive competition. The traders were also organized into societies. Every occupation except agriculture had its society or guild. Farmers were not so organized because just about everybody was a farmer in addition to his trade. Any townsman who did not have a farm somewhere would have been considered strange. One's trade or profession, then, was seen as possible only because of the basic economy, and for that reason everyone was responsible for a share in agricultural production. The general prosperity engendered by the economic revolution did not bring general internal peace. The inevitable increase in population was further expanded by the annexation of new territories and the influx of the endless streams of migrating people who were attracted to this new land of opportunity. But they were strangers, and this fact, as noted above, was a cause of general unrest among them and even greater unrest among the conquered groups. It appears that the national prosperity served to heighten the tensions rather than reduce them. More trouble came from the Baying elements in the country, members of a major tribe that had challenged the Bushung leadership even before the move from Ayul. Rebellions also broke out just before Cheyenne assumed the leadership. The Payang and Keet succeeded in capturing and destroying the capital city, while the unsubdued Baying continued their attacks from the area still under their control. These internal conflicts were of great historical importance because of the far-reaching consequences. The most important overall outcome was radical changes in the traditional constitution. To begin with, religion was drawn upon as an indirect means of social control by enhancing the divine role of the king. The traditional role of the king as chief elder, and therefore the chief representative of the people before God, was easily changed now to the conception of the king as the lieutenant god on earth. As God's lieutenant on earth, the king could assume powers not recognized by the Constitution and go unchallenged. But above and beyond this, the internal turmoil was regarded as such a threat to the nation's existence by the loyal chiefs and the people that even more powers than the king had dared to assume were bestowed upon him to enable him to crush rebellions by direct action and restore internal peace. Here, then, is how a democracy may become an absolute monarchy, not by coup d'etat, but by the consent of the people themselves. They seem to be thinking only about the others, strangers causing trouble, when they allowed the council to give the king the power over life and death. Another fatal blow to the African democratic system was allowing the king to raise and maintain his own national army. The national army, as we know, had always been made up of contingents under the supreme command of the council operating through the representative paramount chiefs and provincial kings. This single change could be said to have completed the triumph of the King of Cuba as an absolute monarch. He had already acquired extraordinary powers quite naturally as the kingdom expanded over new territory. New administrative offices had to be made. Some of these were so important that the king encountered no open opposition when he also appointed them as members of the hitherto exclusive state council. This marked the end of the traditional council as it had functioned under the African constitution. The core council of the 18 elector states was now outnumbered by the appointees of the king. It appears that Siam made no display and very little use of his new powers vis-a-vis the elector chiefs. His chief interest continued to be in the field of internal improvement, building a capital city, and upgrading the social amenities that reflect a highly advanced society. These included new forms of court etiquette and procedures, resplendent regalia, etc. One of Siam's stratagems for securing the loyalty and support of important chiefs and other notables was the appointment of their sons to many important posts. This move was significant because it bypassed the nephews in favor of the sons, thus satisfying the natural but never spoken desire of most fathers in a matrilineal society. The King General. Siam left a record of achievements that none of his successors could match. He was a legend even in his own lifetime. The people had never known or heard about such a leader, and had never experienced in their own lives the direct benefits of such leadership. It had to be magic, and therefore, Siam had to be the great magician. Since magic in Africa was simply another religious means of invoking the aid of a deity, to call their chief intercessor with God a magician meant that he was actually securing benefits for the people, and that he was indeed the lieutenant of God on earth. In short, magic was another form of prayer, song, or dance in the appeals to supernatural powers for help. Mboum Aling, Siam's successor, was not a great magician. He was a warrior king, a great general. He did not have to carry on the economic revolution. It carried on itself from the momentum Siam had given it. Mboum Aling devoted himself to further wars of conquest and the expansion of the royal power, which these wars made easy. The age-grade military system started by Siam was expanded from a militia to a strong-standing army, strong for the period. Prisoners of war, now slaves, formed the king's personal army. They were stationed in separate villages of their own. Now, the king was powerful enough to attempt to make the modest changes in the matrilineal system under Siam more thoroughgoing and permanent in the royal family itself. The royal nephews were all placed under permanent house arrest, and sons of king became heirs to the throne. Meanwhile, they were appointed to important governing posts in different parts of the kingdom. And while it has been suggested that this radical breach of constitutional law was intended to reduce the factional power struggles in the royal family, what it did was to sharpen such struggles along more clearly defined lines. Mboum had divided not only the royal, but all the chiefs and people into the defenders of the traditional constitution on the one hand, and the progressive reformers on the other. This meant more unrest and more rebellions. The king general dealt with these with an iron hand, was successful, and proceeded with another important assault on the constitution. He outlawed migrations from the country. This had been one of the black man's greatest freedoms, the right of every dissatisfied individual or group to withdraw from the community, migrate elsewhere, and either join some other group or set up a new chiefdom. The universal use of this freedom, let it be remembered at every point, is one of the reasons for so many different little societies and language groups throughout the continent, while at the same time indicating a common origin and background. This relatively small and generally unknown kingdom in the Congo region was a microcosm of Black Africa in other respects, and, as in other African states, it presents the concrete evidence and specific validation of much of the history of the black people. There was still another development in Cuba that was occurring all over Africa, a development of the highest importance for ethnologists, but one which they generally bypass or treat very lightly. This had to do with still another way new tribes, new chiefdoms, and new language groups were formed, ultimately not leaving a trace of what the respective members of such groups had been in former times. A new tribe and chiefdom of this kind was formed by strays and stragglers, individuals in very small groups that had become detached from their main society during the migrations. Speaking different languages and dialects, they were unaffiliated persons who were lost in the corporate society of Cuba. Even to become second-class citizens as newcomers, strangers had to be members of a single group large enough to have the traditional tribal socio-political structure headed by a chief. Because of these conditions and circumstances, many stray individuals and small groups from different tribes united and began the formation of a new tribe, a new language from the merger of many, and a new tradition or oral history. Here, too, is how and why oral tradition may become confused and misleading during the first 2 or 3 generations. For the first chief and his family, chosen as founders of the new chiefdom, may attempt to overplay their role in the founding and progress of the new society. The central point that is stressed here again, however, is that the historical process in Africa of segmentation, re-emerging, segmentation, and re-emerging ad infinitum defies all attempts by Western anthropologists to divide and classify the race into opposing ethnic societies. It cannot be done either by linguistics or by conclusions arrived at on the basis of widely different physical features and/or characteristics. All of these observations can be drawn from the most eventful 50 years in the history of Cuba, 1630 to 1680. Notwithstanding the unprecedented changes in the Constitution, ironically enough, the periods of Cuba's glory and greatest achievements were under the leadership of her three great autocratic kings, Siam the Great, Mbung Aling, and Mbo Mbash, 1650 to 1680. With the death of Mbo Mbush, the era of relative peace, stability, and progress came to an end. But that era left us with a perplexing question. Considering the history of the nation before Siam and after Mbush, that question is whether democracy actually served the welfare of the people as well as autocracy. It is an awful question, but here is a specific case where the question rises under its own power. In view of the record, no one has to raise it. It therefore has to be faced. It may be that the tradition-bound councils which we glorify so much because they represented the people and served as a check on chiefs and kings may also have served to check progress under the leadership of dedicated chiefs and kings of far-seeing vision. This in turn introduces the question of the role of leadership in the affairs of men, and particularly in the history of every people that had great leaders who lit the blaze which banished the darkness from their marching paths. Since leadership is indispensable in any group situation, large or small, the ultimate situation in a democracy may be centered around the question not of how much power a leader has, but rather in whose interest and for whose welfare that power is to be used. This presupposes an alert people who know when and where to draw the line between their welfare and the actions of a powerful leader. When Mbung went to the extreme by appointing and deposing chiefs at his pleasure, the people could have checked him. Therefore, the great kings who did so much to build a strong nation also planted the seeds for its destruction from within, long before the Europeans completed its destruction from without. From 1680 until the coming of the Europeans in the 1880s, intermittent internal strife darkened the whole period. The struggle centered around various constitutional violations and changes. These were the main issues, whether the rebellions were led by whole tribes or were civil strife led by royal sons on one hand and royal nephews on the other. Through it all, however, foreign and domestic trade somehow continued to flourish. In fact, the Cuban markets were so widespread outside of the country that these enterprising blacks attracted the attention of the now world-conquering Europeans. They now had business to explore up and down the Kasi and Sankuru rivers, checking on the operations of the Bakuba. Once again, the most crucial points in the history of the blacks were being epitomized by a single small nation. It was to escape the Europeans that, centuries before, the people who formed the Cuban state had continued their migrations from the Atlantic seaboard and journeyed far into the interior. They had come on and along the same rivers the advanced scouts of the enemy were now exploring. The blacks, as usual, were too busy fighting among themselves to mark the heralds of their doom or see the significance of their coming. Up to this time they had been wise enough to adhere to the rule followed by most African states by rigidly barring all non-Africans from crossing their borders. The record of over 4,000 years showed that in each and every case where the rule of exclusion was relaxed and Asians or Europeans were admitted under whatever pretext, the ultimate fate of the blacks was sealed. First, a lone Portuguese came, seeking trade. Who would be silly enough to fear a lone white man? And were not the Cubans, the great traders, always looking for new markets? Nor were the few Germans who came later any occasion for concern other than new opportunities for trade. The exploring expeditions up and down the rivers did not cause alarm. Trading relations with the Europeans were indeed established and were becoming more and more profitable. The Europeans were not yet permitted to settle within the country, but no matter, they were, as we have said, long-range schemers. The pattern of worldwide imperialism had been determined long ago, and the techniques of penetration and dominance were fixed and universally applied. So instead of invading the country by force, something they were never prepared to do initially anyway, they ringed the country with trading posts along its borders. To these outposts, missionaries assembled to form missions for God and the empire, and were later followed by armed detachments, ostensibly to protect the trading routes and the new markets from imaginary raiders. To make matters worse, the European crisis began to develop near the end of the longest and most strife-ridden reign in Cuban history. King Umbap Amabunk Mabumbal was in the 5th decade of his rule, tired and worn out by both age and endless fighting. Far from seeing the gathering Europeans as a threat, he and his immediate successors seemed to have regarded them as a godsend that would solve two critical problems: the Portuguese offer to buy all of the captured rebels and other troublemakers, and the replenishing of a drained treasury by the sale of these war prisoners. The first would tend to end civil strife and restore domestic peace, and the second was a new source of great wealth. To be relieved of the cost and trouble of maintaining prisoner-of-war camps was still another incentive for selling them. For such reasons, the unforgivable sale of blacks into slavery by blacks began. The fact that African chiefs and kings had a quite different conception of slavery than that of the Caucasians does not excuse them, for in the course of time they had to know that in the West the captured blacks became slaves in fact, and not, as in Africa, persons who became members of the community, were integrated into families, became members of any of the crafts, had rights to farmland, held offices, and in fact had all the rights and privileges enjoyed by their original captors. So I am saying that while at first the African slave sellers may not have known the fate to which they were consigning their brothers, in time they did learn, and for this reason the blacks will stand condemned forever before the bar of history, King Ma Mbul along with the others. The sale of malcontents into slavery did not end the civil strife because, for one thing, all the rebels were neither captured nor defeated. Besides, the permanent center of conflict was in the royal lineage itself. The general upheaval after 1885, the year the European conquest of all Africa began, made it easy for the whites to enter and spread all over the country. The traders and missionaries were the first to take over the country by first allying themselves with opposing chiefdoms and opposing royal factions, urging on each to keep up the fight against the others. Indeed, the missionaries in Cuba were missionaries of damnation, not salvation. They wore the deceptive garb of religion, but their activities were not only almost wholly political, but were concerned with furthering the disintegration and collapse of this little black nation. They obviously did not come to help, spiritually or otherwise. They came to hinder, at least until the country was completely under white rule. The next step, therefore, was to actually set up chiefdoms themselves, install puppet chiefs, and rule the country through the chiefdoms over which they and the traders had control. When the 20th century dawned, a dying Cuba was gasping for breath, making its last desperate attempts to free itself from the choking hands it thought had come to bestow Christian blessings. But it was too late. The temporary restoration of the king was too late. The Congo Free State's gesture of assistance was too late. Death arrived according to a schedule, and that was determined by the whites. In 1916, the European-controlled Kot Api, the last to hold the fictitious title of king to disguise white rule, passed from the scene, and the Kingdom of Cuba, having long since died, now had its death certified by the equally small state of Belgium that now ruled a black African region 10 times its size. Cuba was the African experience in so many important respects that it was taken as a case study typical of that experience. We have therefore seen how many of the migrations ended after the people had been uprooted from one place after another. Some to the farthest regions went, found what they believed to be a place of refuge, and began to build again as a separate, isolated society, slowly developing new forms of speech and variations from the original culture. Some found refuge in swamps, caves, and forests, or deserts, where the natural environment alone was an effective barrier to progress and an unspoken command to retrogress to barbarism. Still others, such as the Boshungs, united with other tribes to form a new nation. Out of this new nation there emerged not only a new people composed of many diverse groups, but also a new language similarly made up of different languages and dialects. It was also significant that the new state was formed under the guidelines of the traditional African constitution. Kings were to be elected, and the power center was in the Council of State. There appeared to be a studied program of nation-building by glorifying the unique cultural offerings of each society and making its contributions a part of the whole nation's heritage. Significant, too, was the fact that religion, like other basic institutions, was essentially the same as it was in the heartland of the race. The sky god was still the sun god, and the sun was simply the obvious way to symbolize the reality of the one god concept, the creator of the universe. The role of great leaders as benefactors in human affairs was repeated and made clear again in the life and work of Shyam the Great, and in that of at least two of his successors. Shyam's economic revolution that promoted remarkable progress and prosperity made his new title of Lieutenant of God on Earth readily acceptable, for were not those leaders who looked after the welfare of the people the instruments of the divine will? As we have seen, a political phenomenon develops from this circumstance, in which the people's confidence in the leader is so great that he may be allowed to exercise powers unlimited to further advance the public welfare. It is the genesis of absolutism. Therefore, the study in this state was also a study of how an African democracy evolved into an autocracy without any external influence whatsoever. Cuba revealed something else. We also saw that there was a black imperialism in Africa, all African and without outside influence. Indeed, we saw the microcosm of all the conquests of blacks by blacks, the oppression and enslavement of blacks by blacks, all of which left us the heritage of suspicion, distrust, and hatred that accounts for tribalism, disunity, fear, and unrest today. In spite of it all, the Cuban state was relatively secure as a black power entity until they allowed the whites to come in. At that point, the history of the blacks in Egypt and everywhere else was being repeated, and in exactly the same way. The blacks had learned nothing from their previous experiences with whites. The blacks were therefore doomed to repeat the same big mistakes over and over, meanwhile losing both their civilization and their freedom. As the last days of the kingdom show, the separatist chiefdoms struggling for power actually sought alliances with the whites to overcome this or that black faction. They did this in Egypt and lost. There they continued to form alliances with the whites against blacks even after black rule had been pushed southward below the First Cataract. The whites were only too anxious to oblige in thus helping the blacks to speed up the work in which they were so busily engaged, social disorganization, and the internecine strife that led to white control of their lives. One may wonder if Kata P, the last of the figurehead kings under Belgium rule, ever reflected on how and why the blacks so often seal their own doom.
Please consider supporting us by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons. Your support will be greatly appreciated.